Hey guys, tonight we explore the hush of Twilight across medieval Europe, where a simple hum or whistle could spark more trouble than you'd ever expect. Picture torchlit streets, lanterns swaying in the cool breeze, and watchmen patrolling with heavy cloaks drawn tight. A few muffled footsteps echo on uneven cobblestones. You try not to sneeze, because yes, you might just break an ancient ordinance. And here's the kicker, you probably won't survive this, legally speaking, if you decide to bust out your favorite lullaby at the wrong hour. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk along a narrow alley, stones slippery underfoot from the day's drizzle. Overhead, the sky is a rich navy blue, the sun having bowed out not too long ago. There's a tangible shift in the air. You can sense the curfew creeping in, as if the very walls are whispering hush, hush. In early medieval Europe, curfew bells were a real phenomenon. Each town had a specific time, often signaled by the ringing of church bells, when citizens were expected to bank their fires, shutter their windows, and keep quiet for the night. The original idea, so mainstream historians say, was mostly about preventing nighttime chaos and accidental house fires. Put out the flame, put yourself to bed. Nothing to see here. But you quickly learn there were also hush hour rules that governed singing, chanting, and any other melodic expression after sundown. One reason for these restrictions is surprisingly practical. Small towns might have been prone to illusions in the dark. People couldn't always see who was wandering around, so disembodied voices carried through the streets could trigger panic. Imagine you're alone, you hear a ghostly note carried by the wind. Is it a traveling minstrel, a chorus of rowdy peasants, or a band of outside raiders? In an age when "there's safety in numbers" was more than just a cliché, a random serenade at twilight might be enough to send the entire village into a frenzy. But that's only half the story. Quieter places are easier to police. If the only sound is your own heartbeat, then any suspicious activity or rebellious gatherings become obvious, particularly if they're accompanied by drum beats or a lute. This gave local authorities ample reason to clamp down on all forms of nighttime noise. Yet historians still argue whether the real impetus behind these hush-hour laws was public safety, religious conformity, or a more subtle method of controlling the population's freedom of expression. Maybe all three. Curfew, after all, literally comes from the old French term, cover, feu, meaning, cover the fire. Picture a caretaker or guard walking down the street after dark, shouting, lights out, voices down, unless you want a fine. In some towns, it was more like, lights out, or we'll fling you in the stocks, which is not exactly a comedic scenario, unless you enjoy the thought of spending a night in a medieval stockade. But let's face it, the idea of humming a lullaby, and then scrambling to hide from the local watch does have its ironic charm. Speaking of charm, you might picture wandering troubadours singing romantic ballads under moonlit balconies. While that makes for a good story, it was often frowned upon by official edict. The earliest known noise bans in certain European cities date back to around the 13th century, although some claim they existed in simpler forms even earlier. These ordinances were written in dusty scrolls, rarely updated, yet strictly enforced. In a few scattered texts, you'll find references to any musical disturbance, a phrase so vague it could include anything from an out-of-tune harp to a jester's comedic jig. That begs the question, if someone was whistling off key, was that an arrestable offense? Possibly. However, there's at least one comedic anecdote involving a watchman who caught an off-key whistler and instead of dragging him to the jail, simply handed him a piece of bread, telling him, "Eat this so you'll at least be full while you torture our ears." The consequences for breaking these hush-hour rules varied. In some regions you might get a small fine, maybe a modest sum of coins. In others, a single innocent lullaby could see you forced to clean stables or perform menial labor in front of jeering townsfolk. There are even rumored accounts of more bizarre penalties, like being made to stand outside the church at dawn, singing a forced apology. Imagine you have to serenade the entire village with a ballad that basically translates to, "I'm sorry I disturbed everyone's beauty sleep." If that's not enough to keep your nighttime humming under wraps, nothing is. These laws were not limited to big cities with tall stone walls. Tiny hamlets scattered across what's now Germany, France, and Spain all had their own ways of preserving the peace after dark. And the weird part is, some of these hush hour ordinances included an express mention of no loud conversation. So even talking above a whisper might land you in hot water. People got creative, of course. They'd gather around a dimly lit fireplace and keep their voices at a low murmur, turning every nightly gathering into an unofficial secret meeting. It's like a medieval version of a modern, day-silent disco. You dance in your headphones so your neighbors aren't complaining to the authorities. Occasionally, these laws bumped up against religious practices. Certain monks and nuns observed late night prayers known as matins or vigils. These involved chanting psalms in the still hours before dawn. Technically, that was singing at twilight, or at least in the hours of darkness. But who was going to arrest monks? For the most part, the church's rituals were exempt from these noise bans. Still, that created tension between laypeople, who had to stay quiet, and the ecclesiastical groups, who could chant to their heart's content. One fringe tidbit from old monastic records claims that in a small coastal abbey, the local fishermen petitioned the abbot to hush the midnight choir because their eerie echoes out at sea were scaring off fish. The abbot refused, claiming it was God's will that they keep chanting. Did it work? No one's certain. Interestingly, some places used sunset horns, or twilight horns, to mark the beginning of hush hour. A designated horn blower would stand atop a city tower and unleash a long, mournful note that basically said, "All right, folks, shut your traps." It was an eerie sound, echoing across the rooftops like a ghostly warning that the entire place was about to enter a forced quiet time. If you're the type who's ever disliked that neighbor who revs their motorcycle at 2 a.m., maybe you can sympathize with medieval folks wanting a decent night's sleep, though a horn might be just as loud. For many centuries, these noise bans were as ubiquitous as wooden gates and cobblestone roads. They set the stage for what would evolve into more specific twilight singing restrictions down the line. After all, if the local lords realized they could make rules about fires and conversation, why stop there? The very act of singing, especially if it's passionately off-key, could be labeled a disturbance. And as we'll see, once people in power discovered they could regulate who sings and who doesn't, they did it with gusto. So there you stand, bracing yourself for whatever other curiously strict rules nighttime Europe has in store. The same notion that once stifled a wandering troubadour soon extended to the hallowed halls of monasteries, parish churches, and cathedral choirs. You might assume that church choirs would have a free pass to sing whenever they wanted, holy voices drifting up to the heavens and all that. In some places, that was true. The church was untouchable, above the law in matters of worship. Yet, ironically, there were also communities where even sacred hymns were frowned upon after sundown, mostly because of the potential racket they caused. You picture a simple village, perched on a hill overlooking rolling farmland. The church bell has just tolled the last note of Vespers, a liturgy often held in the early evening. By tradition, there should be a moment of reflection afterward, a hush descending upon the congregation as the day transitions into night. But in certain regions, that hush was more than symbolic. It was enforced if your local choir decided to belt out an extended hymn around dusk. Maybe the organist got a little too enthusiastic. You'd risk angering the local bailiff. Or worse, the formidable night watch, who might barge in mid-verse with a stern, "Seize this racket!" Quick mental check. Are those heavenly sounds worth a fine or a night in the stocks? Tension sometimes flared between ecclesiastical authority and secular power over exactly who could sing and when. Historians still argue whether this was a clash rooted in politics, who's really in charge here, or if it was a practical matter of silencing noise so townsfolk could wind down. After all, in close, knit villages, the church was often right in the center of everything. If the choir decided to rehearse late into the night, the entire settlement might be forced to listen. In an era of thin wooden walls and no earplugs, that was as good as blasting a radio at 2 a.m. Sure, it's spiritual music, but that doesn't mean it's not loud. The church itself played a big role in shaping musical tradition during the Middle Ages. Monastic orders, especially the Benedictines and Cistercians, observed strict schedules of prayer, called the Divine Office, which included chanting several times a day and sometimes at night. As you learned earlier, certain hours, matins, lauds, occurred at or before dawn, while compline happened late in the evening. This meant regular intervals of melodic chanting, albeit usually contained within the monastery walls. Yet not everyone lived next door to a cloister, so the quirk of hearing those echoes at odd hours wasn't necessarily universal. In some areas, you might only catch a faint whisper of chant on the wind, a gentle lullaby that drifts across the fields. On calmer nights, it's actually rather soothing, unless you're a local official with a personal vendetta against any noise after sundown. One mainstream historical fact: the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 significantly influenced church life, insisting on certain uniformities in worship. That might sound dull, but it did standardize the times and forms of liturgical music across regions. Parishioners far and wide were suddenly hearing very similar chants, especially around twilight services. The unintended side effect was that local governments began to realize just how pervasive these nightly services could be. If you lived in a town with a particularly devoted clergy, your evenings might resonate with choral prayers. Most folks were fine with it. Some even found comfort in the daily ritual. But not everyone was a devoted churchgoer, and friction arose when official hush hour bumped against spiritual tradition. As strange as it might seem, there were reports of communities outlawing or limiting evening worship, specifically because the chanting echoed too loudly in the dark. Take a small coastal region, the same one rumored to have spooked the fish. The local magistrate once posted a handwritten notice on the church doors. No chanting after the second toll, lest you incur a penalty of 2 silver coins. Let that sink in, threatening the faithful with fines for singing God's praises at night. Talk about a conflict of interest. What do you do if your vow of obedience as a monk contradicts the local hush law? The older texts don't specify how many monks got in trouble, but presumably a few took a creative route, perhaps humming extra soft or employing a whispered chant. Picture a group of grown men in robes, leaning into one another in the dark, chanting the psalms like a clandestine group of rebellious teens telling ghost stories under a blanket. Of course, there are comedic tales woven into this tension. One frequently shared anecdote concerns a little village that tried to compromise the church could hold an evening service, but the organ would be left silent. Imagine the choir gathered in near darkness, quietly chanting a cappella, determined not to break any rules. Suddenly, a young novice hits a high note. The door creaks open, and in steps the local watchman, tapping his foot with an exasperated look. "You're on thin ice," he growls. Legend says that the watchman then joined in for the final verse of the hymn, presumably because if you can't beat M, might as well sing with them. Whether that tale is true or not, it highlights just how entangled religion and regulation could get. While the church was a formidable institution, the local lords and city councils weren't always willing to bow. And you'd be surprised how quickly a small choir practice could become a flashpoint for a broader power struggle. If we can't agree on a time to sing our evening hymns, how can we handle bigger issues like land disputes or taxes? Human nature being what it is, people sometimes latched onto the smaller battles as a proxy for the bigger ones. Meanwhile, on the fringes, you had traveling friars, individuals who weren't tethered to a single monastery, but roamed from place to place to preach or sing the praises of the divine. They often performed in open squares, sometimes around dusk, to gather a crowd. This was part sermon, part performance art. But if they happened to pitch up in a town with strict hush hour enforcement, the local guards might cut them off mid-sermon and confiscate any collection coins. One might question, isn't it unholy to rob friars? But apparently local statutes trumped that moral conundrum. A fringe tidbit found in a lesser-known register recounts how one traveling friar got creative by distributing earplugs, simple rolled bits of cloth, to the local authorities, politely suggesting they use them if they found his chanting offensive. Did it work? The record doesn't say, but you can almost hear the guard's exasperated sigh. As these twilight chants clashed with secular hush laws, the tension became something of a cultural undercurrent. In some places, new architectural designs emerged to help contain the sound. Thick, walled chapels with fewer windows were erected so that monks and priests could sing into the wee hours without disturbing the neighbors. That's where you get some of those fortress-like churches with narrow slits for windows rather than big, open arches. The stone acted as a natural buffer, keeping most of the chanting within. Great for the choir, but not so great if you were hoping for a gentle lullaby from the next parish over. Historians still debate whether these changes were primarily driven by the desire to keep worship discreet, or if they simply reflect architectural trends of the time, like the shift from Romanesque to Gothic. Perhaps it's a bit of both design meets necessity. The fact remains that by the late Middle Ages, many towns found a sort of uneasy truce. If the church wanted to hold a late service, it had to ensure the choir was done before the watch blew the silent horn, or else face a penalty. Of course, parishes with powerful patrons could skirt these rules. If a wealthy baron or bishop was on your side, your choir might go on singing well into the night with no repercussions. Money talks, or in this case, sings. All this setup, the interplay between sacred music, local hush laws, and the attempts at compromise, laid the groundwork for future Twilight singing controversies. Because once you set a precedent that even church choirs aren't exempt, the stage is set for increasingly peculiar singing ordinances. You might think church music would be the final frontier, an untouchable realm of divine expression. But if prayerful chanting can be silenced by a city council, then surely no form of singing was safe from the hush hour gavel. Before long, the hush hour controversy spreads beyond sleepy villages and church choirs, landing squarely on the gilded doorsteps of kings and queens. Royal courts, famed for their lavish banquets and theatrical displays, prove oddly allergic to the idea that someone else, especially a rowdy crowd of commoners, might be out there crooning at dusk. It's not just about the music. It's about power, who gets to sing, when, and under whose blessing. You wander along a winding palace corridor, plush carpets muffling your footsteps, while stained glass windows filter in the last rays of the sun. A courtier hurries by, arms loaded with scrolls, looking frantic. There's a whiff of drama in the air, and it's more pungent than the patchouli perfume favored by the noble set. Picture a scenario: the king is hosting a twilight feast in the grand hall. Minstrels, invited by the crown, fill the space with dulcet tones. It's all sanctioned, official, and a bit ostentatious. Meanwhile, a local baron, and distant cousin to the king, holds his own banquet in a nearby castle. His hired musicians strike up a tune that echoes across the valley. The king is displeased because no one upstages the monarch's twilight entertainment. Almost overnight, a comically specific edict is drafted, forbidding any serenade performance or operatic whim in the hours after sunset unless sanctioned by the crown. Anyone who defies it risks losing favor, or worse, a portion of their estate. At least that's the rumor swirling through the corridors, and you can't help but chuckle at the idea that an entire law might stem from one petty spat. In some cases, these royal feuds spanned generations. If a particular royal family cherished a quiet evening, their decrees reflected that temperament. Conversely, if a monarch was a known lover of music, like certain members of the French or Habsburg courts, then hush hour rules might be relaxed for their personal enjoyment, but still enforced for everyone else. One mainstream historical fact: Emperor Charles V, who ruled a vast swath of Europe in the 16th century, was said to enjoy private guitar recitals in the twilight hours. That indulgence didn't necessarily trickle down to the masses. While the emperor's personal minstrels plucked strings in a cozy courtyard, local sheriffs still patrolled the streets, ready to clamp down on any unsanctioned lullabies. The double standard was palpable. Sing for the emperor, good. Sing for your sweetheart under the same starry sky, bad. Naturally, these royal edicts had a ripple effect. Lesser nobles, eager to stay in their sovereign's good graces, adopted their own twilight bans or restructured existing ones. If the king declared that nighttime singing was a nuisance, local lords echoed the sentiment. If the queen decided that certain serenades of love made her royal ears itch, her ladies in waiting spread the word to every corner of the realms: hush those romantic ballads. And while some might scoff at these seemingly trivial rules, they carried real weight. One light-hearted anecdote recounts a traveling troupe of actors who tried to perform a comedic operetta at dusk. Unaware of the local ban, they launched into a rousing number, only to have a detachment of guards burst in, confiscate the stage props, and lock the entire cast in a stable for the night. Imagine the horses looking on, thoroughly unimpressed by their new roommates. What's striking is how petty these edicts could be. One king, apparently annoyed by the distant sound of peasants singing, folk tunes outlawed not just the songs, but the instruments themselves at twilight. The official scroll declared, no lute, flute, pipe, drum, or any contrivance producing melody is to be played between the setting and rising of the sun. A fringe tidbit from a lesser-known chronicle reveals that to get around this, some resourceful minstrels in the countryside began making silent instruments, basically miming performances to keep their craft alive. Picture a stringless lyre or a duct-taped flute. They'd go through the motions but produce barely any sound. If a guard came by, the performer would shrug and say, "I'm just polishing my instrument. No noise here." Inventive, if somewhat absurd. Of course, royals didn't issue these rules in a vacuum. Courtly intrigue and personal vendettas played a huge role. If the reigning monarch had a quarrel with a neighboring kingdom, maybe a contested border or a stolen fiancé, banning twilight music in their domain became a form of cultural sabotage. If your neighbour's court is famous for its nightly harp recitals, how better to show your disdain than to pass a law proclaiming such recitals unholy after dark? It's a power move, a way to say, we're civilized enough to know when to keep quiet, unlike those barbarians across the border. You can almost hear the clinking of jeweled goblets as courtiers gossip about the new law, half praising the monarch's firm hand, half worried that they might be the next to step on a melodic landmine. Historians still argue whether these royal spats truly shaped Europe's patchwork of Twilight restrictions, or if local communities were already leaning toward hush-hour laws for practical reasons. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. Many towns had their own long-standing curfews and noise ordinances. The monarchy just added a flashy layer of politics to the mix. Yet once the crown weighed in, these rules took on a new gravity. A humble village might shrug off a local mayor's stern warning, but an edict stamped with a royal seal, that's no joke. Violating it could mean anything from fines to being dragged off to a distant fortress dungeon, an outcome no one particularly relished. You might assume queens were less inclined than kings to issue these hush-hour rules, but evidence suggests otherwise. For instance, there's a rumor about a particular queen, unnamed in the surviving documents, who despised the sound of bagpipes at dusk. She apparently considered it a vulgar moaning, unworthy of her realm. To her ear, the drone triggered migraines. Hence, the local bagpipers found themselves with a brand new rule banning them from playing within earshot of any royal residence after sundown. The bagpipers might have moved their gatherings into the woods, trying to avoid detection while still enjoying their musical tradition. One comedic tale claims a group of them once marched straight into a royal orchard at midnight, hoping the orchard walls would mute the sound. Instead, the queen heard it echoing through her bedchamber, stormed out in her nightgown, and threatened to burn every bagpipe in the kingdom. Whether that's factual or just a tall tale, it paints a vivid picture of how personal tastes could become the law of the land. Beyond the comedic squabbles, these bans sometimes resulted in unintended cultural consequences. If a king loved choral music but hated instrumental tunes, local composers might be encouraged to write vocal-only pieces, forever altering the region's musical landscape. Or if the queen favored a certain style of lullaby, minstrels would scramble to adapt their repertoire to accommodate her taste, hopefully staying one step ahead of the hush-hour restrictions. Over time, certain pockets of Europe developed stronger traditions of nocturnal music performed indoors, behind thick palace walls, since public nighttime performances were no longer feasible. This began a subtle shift. The best musicians catered to the elite, while folk singing in the streets faded into near silence. One might argue that these royal feuds, while often silly on the surface, played a key role in shaping Europe's patchwork of cultural identities. Different territories ended up with distinct rules, each shaped by the quirks of its ruling house. A place governed by an open-minded monarch might allow certain forms of Twilight singing under special permits, like a license to serenade. Meanwhile, a more conservative or irritable ruler might clamp down entirely, turning a once lively community into a silent realm as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. As evening falls on this regal chessboard, you can't help but smirk at the thought of kings and queens engaging in petty disputes over who's allowed to sing at night. For all their grandeur, they seem just as prone to jealousy, pettiness, and mischief as anyone else. Twilight serenades became political tools, bargaining chips, or even direct insults, depending on whose ear they reached. And so, from high towers to hidden forest clearings, from velvet, draped throne rooms to narrow castle turrets, the question of who gets to sing, and who must remain silent, drove some of Europe's most bizarre legal decrees. By now, you've seen how kings and queens could shape a realm's nightly soundtrack. But what about regular townsfolk, those whose daily lives revolved around market days, harvest seasons, and local festivities? As dusk settles over a modest marketplace, rows of timber-framed houses lean crookedly toward one another, their upper stories almost kissing above the street. You smell the lingering aromas of roasted chestnuts and fresh, baked rye bread, mingling with the faint dampness of a day's rain. In the town square, someone once led nightly dances. Imagine a fiddler perched on a barrel, bow-sawing across taut strings while neighbors stamped their feet in a spirited reel. But over time, these simple traditions found themselves in the crosshairs of aristocratic decree. One day, the fiddler simply disappears, along with the once familiar melodies that signaled day's end. Across Europe, local customs varied, but they all shared a common bond. These were the amusements of ordinary people, not high-born lords or well-funded cathedral choirs. Townsfolk gathered at twilight to share gossip, celebrate a good harvest, or just blow off steam. Maybe a young couple quietly slipped away from prying eyes to waltz beneath a starry sky. Eventually, lords and city councils started catching wind of these festivities, especially if they grew too loud. They stepped in, brandishing hush-hour laws like a well-honed sword, declaring, "Enough with the racket." Officially, the rationale was to preserve the peace and ensure townsfolk got enough rest to rise early and work. But if you asked the locals, it felt more like the aristocracy was simply flexing its power. That's where things got bizarre. Imagine you're in a tiny alpine village in what's now Austria. The locals have a long-standing tradition of yodeling at twilight to ward off evil spirits lurking in the mountain passes. It's a once-a-year event, but apparently, the echoes off the rocky slopes create a thunderous cacophony that travels for miles. The aristocratic family that owns the valley finds it unsettling and bans the practice. The result? Secret yodeling societies pop up, organizing clandestine outings to keep the custom alive. Members meet in secluded meadows at midnight, muffling their yodels with woolen scarves. Does that defeat the purpose? Maybe so, but tradition matters. And sometimes, tradition trumps logic, especially when local identity is at stake. Historians still argue whether these bans came from genuine concern, like preventing late-night brawls or protecting neighbors from unwanted noise, or from a broader push for control. It's plausible that a bit of both was involved. Think of a new baron in town, wanting to show off his authority by stamping out wild customs he doesn't understand. Or a lord who feels overshadowed by the raucous gatherings that happen right outside his castle walls. If the people are chanting and dancing every evening, does that leave room for them to revere him, the rightful ruler? You'd be amazed how many petty motivations can masquerade as civic well-being. One mainstream historical fact: festivals like Midsummer's Eve, widely celebrated across Europe, often involved singing, dancing around bonfires, and general merrymaking well past sunset. As these gatherings grew in popularity, local authorities in certain regions became uneasy. Fires in the night, drunken singing, that's a recipe for mayhem, or so the official proclamations would say. Over time, some places placed strict conditions on Midsummer's Eve celebrations, dictating exactly when the bonfire must be extinguished and how loudly participants could sing. If you exceeded the decibel level, though nobody measured it scientifically in those days, there'd be a fine or a night in jail. A fringe tidbit comes from a small town in what is now southern Italy, where villagers had a peculiar twilight festival called La Cantata dell'Ombras, the Song of the Shadows. During this festival, they would gather in an olive grove at dusk and sing a haunting refrain meant to honor the spirits of ancestors. It was a centuries-old custom. At some point in the 15th century, the local duke decided it was a pagan ritual and promptly outlawed it. The villagers, stubborn as ever, moved the singing deeper into the groves and crafted special cloaks to blend in with the trees. Legend says the duke, upon hearing the faint chanting echoing through the moonlit groves, was so spooked by what he assumed were actual ghosts that he reversed the ban. Whether it's pure folklore or partially true, it underscores how local belief systems could clash dramatically with a single aristocratic whim. Often, penalties for violating twilight bans were more humiliating than physically harmful. You might be forced to parade through town wearing a sign that read, "Noisy Nightingale," or stand beneath the clock tower at dawn and publicly recite an apology in rhyme. Others faced stiffer punishments. Some lords preferred hitting offenders where it hurt their wallets. Fines could be steep, and the local reeve, basically a medieval tax collector, was all too eager to cash in on your misstep. He'd ambush you with a smirk as you tried to slip home quietly after a late night sing-along. "That'll be 3 shillings, or a week in the pillory," he'd say, clapping you on the shoulder with mock sympathy. Sometimes entire communities resisted these laws in creative ways. Think of towns that rebranded their raucous singing as ceremonial chanting, tied to a religious event. Since religious gatherings often received special exemptions, the local populace could claim their festival was an extension of Vespers. You'd see laborers and fishmongers slipping into robes, lighting candles, and trying to look pious as they belted out anthems that sounded suspiciously like rowdy drinking songs. If confronted by a bailiff, they'd bow low and proclaim, "But sir, we honor Saint Cecilia this night." And hey, who's to say they didn't? In other places, the hush hour rules produced a sort of underground economy. Clandestine singing clubs met in basements or barns, charging a small fee for entry and silence. Everyone was sworn to secrecy, no boisterous laughter on the way home, lest the neighbors suspect something. The instruments were hidden, the doors bolted. It was like a speakeasy for medieval minstrels, minus the illicit whiskey, okay? Maybe plus a bit of homemade cider. One comedic anecdote tells of a secret choir that got so paranoid about discovery, they used sign language to communicate between songs. Can you imagine a group of lute players and vocalists in medieval garb, silently gesturing, "Start again from verse 2," or "Keep it down, the watch is outside"? You start to realize just how important these local customs were to communal identity. In an era before mass media or travel brochures, a town's unique traditions, be they dancing, chanting, or singing, helped define who they were. Abandon those traditions, and you strip away a part of the social fabric. For many, singing at twilight wasn't just noise, making it was a collective exhale after a day's labor, a chance to bond, flirt, mourn, or celebrate. So you can imagine the simmering resentment when an aristocratic decree tried to shut it all down. Over time, these tensions fueled occasional outbursts of protest, albeit small ones, like villagers refusing to pay certain taxes or staging a silent mockery of the local lord. Picture dozens of people in the square, pretending to sing with open mouths, but no sound emerging. Historians continue to debate how successful these bands really were in curbing nighttime revelry. Certainly, some communities fell in line, especially if punishments were harsh. Others found loopholes, formed hush-hour alliances, or simply risked a penalty for the sake of tradition. The result is a tapestry of stories, some comedic, some tragic, and many downright weird. Through it all, the simple act of singing after sunset grew increasingly tangled in questions of class, governance, and culture. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll discover many of these old laws lingered like ghosts in dusty legal tomes, rarely enforced but never fully repealed. Even as Europe modernized, traces of the old hush-hour mentality persisted in local ordinances that mandated quiet evenings. People might not remember the exact origins, maybe something about an angry baron or a spooked duke. But the residue of those rules still shape behavior. And so, you stand at dusk in a small European town today, hearing the faint strum of a guitar echo from a distant courtyard. You can't help but wonder, is that a relic of times when singing at twilight was an act of rebellion, or merely a local tradition that outlived all attempts to snuff it out? You wander the narrow back streets of a bustling medieval city, where the aroma of spice dal and charred onions drifts through the air. The chatter of daytime crowds has faded, replaced by a hushed undercurrent of expectation. This is where the street musicians once reigned, roaming entertainers who eked out a living by strumming, plucking, and singing to passers-by. But now, with twilight at hand, there's tension in every note. You sense it as soon as you pass the first row of shuttered stalls. The city watch is out, and there's a rule to be followed. No nighttime music allowed, at least not openly. A short while ago, these same streets might have echoed with a minstrel's tune, a lively jig meant to draw a few coins from travelers. Street musicians were a fixture of medieval city life, improvising fresh songs on the spot or belting out bawdy ballads they'd learned along the trade routes. Yet local statutes, shaped by aristocratic whim and the push for quiet, forced them to adapt. Eventually, the concept of midnight guilds arose. The name itself conjures images of clandestine gatherings in back alleys or dimly lit taverns. But the real story is both simpler and stranger. These guilds were informal networks of street performers who banded together for mutual support against hush-hour laws. Try to picture it: you're a traveling lute player. You slip into a dusty courtyard behind the city stables, quietly meeting up with other instrumentalists. A drum rests at someone's feet, muffled with a cloth. Another musician clutches a battered flute with a cork jammed in the mouthpiece to keep it silent until showtime. Everyone shares tips. Who among the city guard might accept a bribe? Where to find an old wine cellar that resonates beautifully while keeping your performance hidden? A husky-voiced troubadour cracks a joke. Let's hope no one's donkey decides to sing along, or we're done for. One mainstream historical fact: many larger European cities developed formal musician guilds in the late Middle Ages, recognized by local authorities. These were meant to regulate quality and training, but they also set performance rules, like where and when music could be played. If you weren't part of a recognized guild, you could face serious trouble for performing in public. But guess what? Membership fees were steep, and many free, spirited buskers couldn't afford them. Thus, the clandestine midnight guilds were born out of necessity. There's a humorous tale told among buskers about the time they performed for an overly strict bailiff. Late one evening, as the bailiff was making his rounds, a group of musicians stood silently at the edge of the square. When the bailiff demanded to know why they were lingering, they answered, "We're waiting for sunrise to start our set." Amused by their literal interpretation of the hush hour law, the bailiff doled out no punishment. He just groaned and stomped away. The moment he disappeared around the corner, the players struck up a flurry of notes, only to freeze again when they heard his footsteps returning. This comedic back and forth repeated until, legend says, the bailiff left in exasperation, grumbling that the city's fine money wasn't worth the headache. Historians still argue whether these hush-hour statutes were meant to protect respectable musicians, like court performers and church choirs from street-level competition, or if they genuinely sought to maintain quiet after dusk. It's probably a blend of both. Upper-class patrons wanted to ensure they had exclusive access to professional music on their own terms, while city officials worried about rowdy gatherings around buskers attracting pickpockets and scoundrels. After all, a lively jam session might be the perfect cover for shady business dealings. So how did traveling entertainers navigate this minefield of rules? They got crafty. Some buskers began advertising private Twilight performances in the homes of sympathetic patrons. By moving the show indoors behind thick stone walls, they bypassed public noise restrictions. It was invitation, only a precursor to modern house concerts. You'd pay a small fee, bring your own mug of ale, and gather in a cramped living room to listen to a short lute set or a comedic ballad. Occasionally, the local watch got wind of these hush-hour speakeasies and raided them. But more often, they let it slide in exchange for a discreet bribe, or ironically, a custom serenade for the guard captain's next anniversary. A fringe tidbit in the southwestern corner of Europe, particularly along the Iberian Peninsula, roving bands of Moorish-influenced musicians added a unique flavor to medieval street culture. They blended Spanish guitar-like instruments and haunting vocal styles. Rumor has it some city councils tried to ban their music outright, citing it as unfamiliar and thus discordant. The buskers responded by adopting local Christian hymns, performing them with a distinct Moorish twist. The result was a mesmerizing fusion that won over many townspeople, even if the authorities rolled their eyes. If you won't let us sing our songs, we'll sing yours, just slightly differently. Naturally, the City Watch served as the front line of enforcement. These were the men and occasionally women, trudging through alleyways at dusk, lanterns in hand, looking for any sign of illegal melodies. Nighttime busts could be comedic or brutal, depending on the watchman's personality. Some watchmen relished the chase, imagining themselves as heroic defenders of sleep. Others couldn't be bothered, only acting when forced by an official complaint. Street musicians learned to read the signs. If the guard carried a half-eaten meat pie and had mustard stains on his tunic, he was probably in too good a mood to arrest anyone. On the other hand, if his posture screamed, "Didn't get enough sleep," best to wrap up that ballad and vanish into the shadows. In truth, many city folks had a love-hate relationship with these performers. On one hand, who doesn't enjoy a lively tune under moonlight? On the other, some might worry about noisy gatherings leading to restless nights, or worse, potential brawls among drunken revelers. Also, let's not forget the comedic possibility that half the buskers were horribly out of tune. Nothing kills romance faster than an off-key lute outside your window at midnight. Is that a love song or a wounded cat? Became a common jibe among Rye townsfolk. Over time, public tolerance ebbed and flowed. In certain eras, new city councils would briefly relax hush-hour laws, allowing a festival atmosphere to bloom at dusk. Then, after a rowdy incident, say, a scuffle broke out during a fiddler's session, those freedoms would be clamped down on again. We see a cycle of liberalization and crackdown, repeated across the centuries. When peace was stable and the economy thriving, people craved more music and spectacle. During times of war, plague, or social unrest, hush-hour rules returned with a vengeance. Still, no matter how stringent the regulations, night owl musicians found a way. Even if it meant performing in deserted courtyards or shipping warehouses, they kept the music alive, fueled by the coins tossed at their feet and their passion for the craft. Some even earned local celebrity status. You can imagine how that might vex the authorities. We told them to stop, and now they have fans. Indeed, a rebellious fiddler or balladeer who flouted the rules could become a folk hero, revered for thumbing his nose at the pompous hush-hour proclamations. So as you walk these winding streets, passing silent alleys and taverns where the door is locked from the inside, you can still sense a heartbeat, a rhythm pulsing beneath the quiet veneer. The hush hour might stifle the city's official soundtrack, but clandestine notes flutter just below the surface. Somewhere nearby, a lone minstrel lifts his lute and tests a chord. There's a subtle chord progression that hints, we're not done yet. Because music, like life, has a funny way of persisting, no matter how many laws attempt to hush it. You step from the city's lamplit streets into a quieter, more residential quarter. Narrow row houses leaning precariously against each other, windows shuttered tight against the chill of night. Out here, the sound of a voice carries far, bouncing off cramped alley walls and neighbors' balconies. You hear a faint rustle from behind a curtain, maybe someone peeking out to see if the watch is making its rounds. They're tense, and for good reason. The hush hour laws in this district are no joke. Raising your voice even slightly could bring a stern knock at the door. A few paces later, you hear the softest lullaby drifting from a dimly lit window overhead. The melody is too muffled to make out the lyrics, and the singer seems to be warbling into a blanket, as though it's a sound barrier. It might be a mother trying to soothe her cranky toddler, or perhaps a grandmother humming an old folk tune she learned decades ago. Either way, she's taking precautions, like a secret agent smuggling contraband notes across the border. Only her contraband is a melody. When hush hour rules became more stringent in certain European locales, people had to get creative. If you couldn't sing out loud, you whispered your tune or hummed it under your breath. Talk about the world's gentlest form of rebellion. Picture a family gathered around a hearth, exhausted from a day of labor. The father absent-mindedly hums a harvest song. Instantly, the mother places a finger to her lips. Shh, as the children giggle. One slip and they might face a fine. Or, depending on the local lord's temperament, something a bit harsher, like scrubbing pots in the town hall while onlookers mock them. So they carry on in hushed voices, like they're passing a secret code. These muted melodies also found their way into bedtime rituals. In an era with no radios, no streaming services, just your own voice or an occasional musical instrument, singing was a core means of entertainment, emotional release, and comfort. Imagine you're a parent with a fussy infant, well past sundown. The hush hour law forbids loud noises, but the baby doesn't care about local statutes. You have two options. Try your best pantomime lullaby, or risk the neighbors reporting you for disturbing the peace. Legend has it some cunning parents actually stuffed cloth around the crib to dampen the sound, effectively creating a baby sound booth. One comedic anecdote recounts a father so desperate he would hum into a large clay jug, believing the pottery would diffuse the noise into a softer, more acceptable echo. Did it work? Likely not, but you can't fault his determination. This leads to peculiar scenes: grown adults turning songs into faint whispers, pressing their lips against pillows, or standing inside closets to practice an aria in secret. If you ask them why, they'd shrug and say, better safe than sorry. Historians still argue whether these overcautious behaviors were widespread or more anecdotal, but there's enough mention in local records. Complaints from neighbors, snide remarks in court documents, to show that muffled singing did exist. One mainstream historical fact: the Statute of Winchester in 1285s, across parts of England, formalized a nationwide curfew and required that all fires be banked and lights doused. Although it didn't explicitly mention singing, it did emphasize that any nocturnal disturbance could lead to legal trouble. A person patrolling the streets at night could demand quiet, or even arrest someone for suspicious noise. Over time, local officials naturally folded necessary singing into that category, particularly if they found the tune off-key. A fringe tidbit emerges from a lesser-known archive in a Bavarian town, where a few entries detail how families tried to drown out their lullabies with the sound of churning butter. Picture a rickety old churn in the corner of a one-room cottage, plunger moving methodically while the mother hums into it. The rhythmic clunking masked her voice, just enough that passers-by heard nothing but a tedious household chore. One can only imagine how many ears of unsuspecting travelers did a double take at that suspiciously musical butter churning after dark. Let's not forget, these hush hour rules also affected communal gatherings. Weddings were a prime example. You'd have a joyful celebration in the daylight hours, plenty of feasting, laughter, toasts, maybe a few energetic dances. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the watchful eyes of the local bailiffs reminded everyone to keep it down. A wedding without raucous singing. That's like a modern party without music at all. Some couples got around this by scheduling the wedding service so early that all major festivities concluded before twilight. Others quietly bribed the local guards to look the other way, or arranged for a quick, whispered group chant that ended precisely at curfew. Who knew wedding planning could be such an exercise in stealth? Of course, you can't stifle human nature entirely. After a few cups of mead or wine, the impulse to belt out a hearty bollard becomes overwhelming. Tales abound of watchmen storming into taverns, only to find red-faced patrons with bulging cheeks, holding back boisterous songs, as if they were about to erupt. A comedic moment might unfold. A guard arrives, the drunken group stares wide-eyed, and after a beat of silence, they break into forced coughing fits, trying to disguise the tune that was on the tip of their tongues. The guard, unimpressed, shakes his head, threatens a fine, and moves on. The second the door closes, the half-sung melody bursts forth in a chaos of half-laughter, half-song, like shaking a bottle of champagne before popping the cork. Punishments for humming or whisper singing were usually mild, but they served as enough of a deterrent. A small fine might be required, or you'd have to do some public service, like sweeping the courtyard of the local magistrate's estate. There's a recorded instance in a French provincial town where 3 sisters were arrested for softly harmonizing at their window after curfew. Their punishment: they had to stand in the town square the next morning and recite a formal apology in verse. Something along the lines of, "We regret our lullaby, though sweet and small, for breaking hush, our rules that bind us all." If that doesn't make you want to tie a knot in your vocal cords at dusk, nothing will. Yet for all the fear these laws instilled, life found ways to adapt. Low-toned lullabies became the norm. Folk songs were reworked into call and response whispers. Some families even passed down specialized, nighttime versions of their favorite tunes with truncated phrases and quieter registers, like an acoustic set for an audience of 2. In certain enclaves, local authorities turned a blind eye if the singing was truly soft and ended before the night watch's second patrol. As long as you weren't raising the roof, they didn't see a need to enforce the law too rigidly. Another comedic scenario: traveling troubadours who learned the art of mirroring, where they'd sing in a barely audible voice, directing it toward a hard surface, like a courtyard wall, so the music would bounce back at a gentler volume to those gathered. It's reminiscent of someone in a hotel hallway trying to share a late night joke without disturbing other guests, half laughing into the wallpaper. The watchers, passing at the far end of the street, might only catch a faint echo. If confronted, the troubadour could claim, "I was speaking to the wall, not singing," which, to be fair, might raise its own set of concerns about mental stability, but at least it wasn't a prosecutable offense. All these cunning adaptations illustrate just how crucial music and singing were in daily life. Even when faced with bans and potential penalties, people found ways to keep lullabies alive, albeit subdued and cleverly disguised. Such quiet forms of expression may not carry the grandeur of a public concert or a grand cathedral choir, but in a sense, they embody something more intimate: the perseverance of culture and human connection, even under strict constraints. Eventually, as some of these rules softened in later centuries, folks could reclaim the fuller version of their songs. But for those generations who lived through the hush, hour peak, singing was a secret delight, a whispered comfort in the dark. Tonight, as you linger in these silent streets, you almost miss the hush of a hidden lullaby, like a ghostly note suspended in the damp air, just waiting to be heard. The path leading out of town is barely more than a dirt track, meandering past a grove of oak and birch. You hear rustling in the upper branches, songbirds settling down for the evening. A gentle hush blankets the countryside, but it's not just the coming night that's silencing the world. In these parts, there's a peculiar rule: no imitating birds at twilight. Yes, really, the local authorities believe that human attempts to mimic the sweet warble of a nightingale or the raucous caw of a crow can trigger confusion, both among actual birds and, oddly enough, among local officials. You might be thinking, how could chirping a little birdsong get anyone in trouble? But in a world where hush-hour laws are as thick as brambles, just about anything is possible. You step off the main road, letting the canopy above filter out the last rays of twilight. Centuries ago, folks in certain European regions held superstitions around bird calls. Some believed that mocking a bird's twilight song invited bad spirits, or disrupted a natural order that kept farmland fertile. Others thought that such imitations were coded signals for smugglers or rebels. The local lords, always eager to maintain control, latched onto that paranoia. Before long, laws popped up forbidding any sort of artificial birdsong after sundown. And so, if you made the slightest peep that sounded like a cuckoo, you risked a hefty fine, or a stern lecture, at the very least. Historians still argue whether these laws were primarily driven by genuine fear of sabotage. Imagine a secret society communicating via owl hoots, or by the superstition that meddling with nature's nocturnal chorus would anger the gods. In some dusty records, you'll find references to ritual bird calls, used in old pagan ceremonies, which might have clashed with the church's preference for quiet piety at night. Perhaps local rulers lumped all these concerns together: superstition, conspiracy, and the general hush-hour mania. The simplest solution: ban all bird imitating nonsense once darkness falls. Picture the comedic scenarios that emerged. You're a shepherd, strolling home with your flock at dusk. One of your sheep bleats in a weird high-pitched way, spooking a nearby watchman. Convinced someone is chirping illegally, he hustles over, lantern bobbing, and demands an explanation. You protest. It's just a sheep with a sore throat. The watchman eyes you suspiciously, as if waiting for you to break into a thrush's melody. At last, he realizes it's indeed a sheep, not a human in cahoots with an underground bird call cult. He stomps off, grumbling something about the blasted noise laws. Then there's the rumor of a traveling minstrel who figured out how to mimic at least a dozen bird calls so convincingly that actual sparrows would flock around him. Naturally, he loved showing off at local fairs, right around twilight, when the crowds were most enthralled. Word got out, and the local lord slapped him with a special injunction: no vocal mimicry of fowl, be it domestic or wild, after the sun has departed from sight. The minstrel, seeing a comedic opening, took to whistling his repertoire at midday instead. When curious townsfolk asked why he didn't perform at dusk, when it sounded most magical, he'd roll his eyes and respond, "Ask his lordship and his bizarre law." If that's not an eye roll moment, what is? One mainstream historical fact: you might recall the medieval bestiary tradition. These were illustrated manuscripts describing all manner of real and mythical beasts, birds included. Monks painstakingly copied these volumes, adding moral lessons tied to each creature. Nightingales were praised for their enchanting nighttime song, while owls symbolized darkness or even evil. Over time, these associations seeped into popular belief, so copying a nightingale's voice might be considered a form of divine reverence, whereas mimicking an owl's screech could be taken as dabbling in witchcraft. With hush-hour rules already in place, it wasn't a stretch for some particularly pious communities to deem any nighttime bird imitating as flirting with trouble. Meanwhile, in certain rural hamlets, children played a game called Shadow Chirp. The idea was to stand in a dark courtyard and try to echo the sounds of the twilight birds. If you succeeded, and the birds answered back, you'd win local bragging rights. But once hush-hour laws took effect, parents scolded kids for risking a family fine or worse. A fringe tidbit emerges from an old ledger in a remote mountain region. It notes how one father was forced to pay a month's worth of farm produce to the local reeve because his daughters, chirping, led the watch to believe a signal was being passed to bandits. The poor girl had only been practicing her sparrow calls for fun. If you've ever found yourself whistling a carefree tune in a quiet park, you can appreciate how natural it feels to communicate with the birds, responding to a robin's trill with your own attempt. But under these twilight bans, you'd have to choke back that impulse or face the consequences. Some people resorted to extremely quiet, open-mouthed whistling, barely audible unless you pressed your ear right up against them. Others settled for drumming their fingers in a staccato pattern on a table, hoping to mimic a woodpecker without technically singing. It's a bit like playing the world's most awkward game of charades with local wildlife, always glancing over your shoulder in case a guard is lurking. Picture the natural birds themselves, serenading the night with no concept of hush-hour edicts. A nightingale's warbling echo drifts across a silent lake. Some poor traveler, not realizing the local mania, hums back in admiration. Next thing you know, a vigilant watchman emerges from the bushes pointing an accusing finger. "You there, with the suspicious whistling?" Cue exasperated arguments, comedic standoff, and quite possibly a late night trip to the magistrate. If only the traveler had known the bird calls were best left to the birds. Occasionally, these restrictions would be relaxed for practical reasons. For instance, certain farmers used call and response hoots to chase away pests or guide lost livestock at dusk. If that method was proven effective, local councils might issue special exemptions for farm use only. But woe unto the careless peasant caught using their official farm hoot for a bit of personal amusement. Bureaucracy reared its head even in bird-mimic territory. Over the centuries, the sheer oddity of these laws prompted some local leaders to scrap them altogether. They realized that punishing someone for a silly whistle was more trouble than it was worth. Yet in other places, these rules lingered in dusty law books, rarely enforced but never formally repealed. You can imagine an unsuspecting modern tourist stumbling across a centuries-old ordinance forbidding them from calling out to the storks or crows at twilight. Confusion ensues, is this law still in effect? And the locals might shrug, saying, technically, yes, but no one cares unless you annoy the mayor. It's an oddly endearing snapshot of how old superstitions and hushed-hour mentalities can leave bizarre remnants in modern codes. Looking around, you marvel at the varied ways humans try to regulate something as basic as a nighttime melody, be it singing a lullaby or copying a bird's chirp. Each law highlights a point in history where fear, superstition, or power struggles overshadowed the simple joy of making sounds at dusk. Even nature itself, in all its winged glory, got tangled in the web of hush-hour rules. Tonight, in the gentle darkness of this old road, you can't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the birds, blissfully unaware that their own voices stirred such legal fuss among the two-legged creatures below. As you draw closer to the next village, the birds' twilight chorus gradually fades into the hush of full night. A lonely owl hoots in the distance, unbothered by the rules of men. You wonder if a curious soul might be out there, cupping hands around their mouth, trying to hoot back, and if they'll get caught in the act. Perhaps they'll plead ignorance, or claim they were merely clearing their throat. Either way, one thing's certain in this corner of Europe's peculiar past: even a bird call isn't safe from the long arm of the hush-hour law. You weave your way through the twilight, navigating the crooked alleys with caution. Here, the flicker of candles and lanterns reveals more than just the city's shape. It betrays how heavily authorities rely on limited light to monitor any suspect sound. The watchmen, sometimes called sonic snoopers by disgruntled townsfolk, pace the perimeter, lanterns swinging at their hips. Their job is to enforce hush hour, and they take it seriously, prowling the dim corridors for any sign of forbidden singing. At first glance, they appear like shadows against the uneven walls, cloaks billowing in the faint glow. One watchman clutches a narrow horn intended to sound the alarm if he hears a single note out of place. You can't help but think, is the horn itself not a loud disturbance? Yet, irony never stopped a determined city council from arming its guards with an ear-splitting tool. You watch from the corner as a pair of them halts beneath a sputtering lantern, leaning in to whisper conspiratorially. Maybe they're swapping gossip about who might break the hush hour next, or perhaps they're complaining about how cold it is. Could be both. After all, even the watchman needs some small talk to pass the time. It might seem excessive, but in centuries past, especially throughout certain parts of Europe, these nightly patrols were an accepted norm. Town dwellers actually counted on guards to protect them from lurking dangers. One mainstream historical fact stands out. In 1667, Paris famously introduced an early form of organized street lighting by installing thousands of lanterns. It was seen as a major innovation for public safety. Other cities followed suit in later decades, setting out lanterns on main streets to deter crime and inadvertently to make hush-hour enforcement easier. By the flicker of that new lighting, watchmen could see who was humming or strumming well after curfew. Yet historians still argue whether these measures were truly about safety or more about controlling citizens' behavior. Did the flickering lanterns and roving watchmen genuinely reduce robberies? Or did they simply give local authorities a more efficient way to clamp down on after-dark singing and other undesirable activities? There's no denying that petty crime likely dropped when the streets weren't pitch black. But one can't help suspecting that the hush-hour mania also benefited from the glow of those lanterns. If you're performing an illicit bollard, you definitely don't want to be standing under a bright street lamp like you're on the world's smallest theater stage. The comedic potential is huge. Imagine a sly troubadour trying to avoid detection. He scurries from one circle of darkness to the next, hugging the walls whenever he spots a lantern up ahead. Perhaps he times his footsteps to coincide with the watchman's to avoid being singled out by the echo of his boots. Maybe he clutches a half-snuffed candle of his own, hoping to illuminate his music notes but not enough to reveal his presence to the patrols. It's like a medieval version of hide and seek, complete with candle wax drips and the faint smell of scorching wicks. And then there are the amateur snoopers. Among regular townsfolk, you've heard the type, that one neighbor who just loves to poke a candle in someone's face and say, "I heard a suspicious noise." Care to explain? Some city councils even offered small rewards for reporting hush-hour violations, so it's no surprise that ordinary folk sometimes turned vigilante. One comedic anecdote concerns a bread maker who lived above his shop. Every night, he'd sit by his window with a dim lantern, scanning the street below for any sign of illegal singing. Whenever he caught so much as a hum, he'd rush down with flour still clinging to his apron, brandishing a wooden spoon like a sword, ready to perform a citizen's arrest. The watchman reportedly found him more annoying than helpful, but a reward is a reward. Candles and lanterns also played a role in how hush hour suspects defended themselves. If a watchman confronted you in a dim alley, you could pretend to be fumbling with your lantern's wick, claiming the rustling and low chanting noises came from your attempt to keep the flame from going out. Or, if you were really bold, you could blow out your lantern entirely and stand perfectly still, letting darkness cloak you. It's a gamble, one misstep, and they'll hear the scrape of your shoe, a cough, or that telltale warble in your voice. But if you succeed, you become just another shadow in a city where shadows abound. As the hush hour mania evolved, some places deployed specialized listeners, who stationed themselves at vantage points, tall towers, rooftop balconies, or watch platforms near city gates. Their job was, quite literally, eavesdropping on the breeze. If they caught a snippet of melody floating across the rooftops, they'd alert the roaming guards below. This feels like a twisted competition. Can you sing softly enough that no one on the rooftops can detect you? One fringe tidbit from a small city, state near the Adriatic, claims they stationed watchers at the top of their bell tower at dusk, instructing them to ring a tiny handbell if they heard any after-dark music. Picture it, you open your mouth to croon just one lullaby stanza, and ding ding, ding echoes across the city. That's your cue to zip it and run. You might wonder how everyday folks coped. For one, they learned the art of ventriloquism, at least a rudimentary medieval version of it. If you could throw your voice, the watchman might be fooled into wandering down the wrong lane. A comedic image arises: a guard, lantern held high, turning circles in a deserted courtyard while faint singing seems to bounce from wall to wall. And somewhere nearby, a grinning minstrel quietly congratulates himself on a job well done. Of course, we can't vouch for how many people truly mastered ventriloquism, but the legends persist. Those with a more practical bent experimented with architecture. In some wealthier homes, small soundproof rooms were added, walls stuffed with rags or straw to muffle noise. There, families could gather for a nighttime tune without worrying about a knock at the door. The irony is that these rooms also became prime spots for secret business meetings or, rumor has it, covert romantic trysts. Maybe hush hour laws inadvertently facilitated a rise in clandestine relationships. After all, you had a perfect excuse to meet in a cozy, hidden chamber. Officer, we're merely practicing quiet songs together. Sure, that's convincing. No discussion of nighttime illumination would be complete without mentioning how precarious candles and lanterns could be. A stray gust of wind, and your source of light vanished, leaving you in pitch black. That might be the watchman's advantage, or it might be yours, depending on who sees better in the dark. More than one comedic anecdote involves a hapless guard tripping over a stray cat in the gloom, cursing loud enough to break his own hush hour. If only we had CCTV to capture that comedic gold. But beyond the jokes, it's hard not to see these glow-lit patrols as a symbol. A single flame in the vast darkness might represent order, law, and authority. Everyone else is expected to keep silent, hidden in the surrounding shadow. Did hush hour laws truly keep crime at bay and neighborhoods serene? Or did they mostly serve to remind people that they were being monitored, down to the very pitch of their hum? The debate rages on, and each side can cherry-pick examples to bolster its argument. Some historians cite records of reduced nighttime brawls and thefts under strict hush hour enforcement. Others point to reams of complaints about excessive fines, wrongful accusations, and the stifling of local culture. Tonight, as you pass a row of lanterns swaying in the breeze, you can almost feel the watchful eyes behind them. Every flicker reveals the city's determination to shape the after-dark experience, preferably one of quiet compliance. In this corner of medieval Europe, silence is golden, and the smallest spark of melody could betray you. Yet, in some hidden chamber or unlit courtyard, someone is likely still humming, still rebelling in their own gentle way, because for all the official might arrayed against them, the human urge to fill darkness with music can never be fully contained. After all, when the lanterns are eventually blown out and the city is plunged into true night, that's when the real songs, no matter how soft, come alive. As you wander past the silent streets and shuttered windows, you come across a rather unassuming warehouse. The chipped sign above the door might read, "Grain Storage," or "Silk Imports," if you can even make out the faded lettering. But don't let that fool you. Tonight, it's something else entirely, a clandestine opera house in disguise. You step inside, and instead of dusty crates and spider webs, you find rows of improvised seating fashioned from wooden barrels and rickety benches. The flicker of candles and lanterns is kept minimal, enough to see the makeshift stage, but not so bright as to attract a prying patrol's attention. A hush falls over the audience, a motley crew of townsfolk eager for a taste of high culture forbidden after Twilight. They're dressed plainly, some still in work clothes from the day's labor, but a few are clearly in costume. A borrowed cloak here, a masquerade mask there, all part of the charade to keep identities under wraps. You sense the excitement, the thrill of pulling one over on the hush hour laws. This isn't a simple folk song or a discreet lullaby. It's a full-blown albeit hushed, performance that blends drama and melody, complete with a few actors who probably spent half their lives perfecting an aria, only to be told, not after sunset. In reality, early opera houses in Europe, like those in Italy, weren't just about majestic grandeur, they were also closely watched by local authorities. One mainstream historical fact is that the very first public opera house, established in Venice in the 17th century, drew massive crowds. People from all walks of life flocked to see productions that had never before been accessible to the everyday listener. That popularity threatened the hush hour status quo. If so many were coming together at twilight to watch a flamboyant show, who was left to patrol the city's corners or keep peace in the narrow lanes? And so, in more conservative regions, local lords or city councils declared that large-scale performances of song and drama after dusk were unwelcome, to say the least. Of course, that didn't stop the determined. Enter the concept of camouflaged venues. Picture a legitimate storehouse or a closed, down stablery outfitted with hidden trapdoors and a discreet stage built at the far end. It might have an emergency exit that looks like a simple wooden hatch leading to a neighboring courtyard. If the hush hour enforcers came knocking, the performers would douse the lights, hush the audience, and seamlessly rearrange props so it all looked like mundane storage. To the watchman's lantern beam, it'd be a dim space filled with hay bales or stacked crates. Meanwhile, the entire ensemble would be crouched behind a false wall, breath held, praying no one sneezed. In these covert gatherings, the volume of music had to be carefully moderated. Opera, by its very nature, calls for powerful vocals that resonate through a grand hall, but a clandestine setup demanded more subtlety. No triumphant crescendos that could carry through thin walls or echo down the street. Instead, you'd see a scaled-down ensemble, maybe a handful of strings and a harpsichord that had been dampened with cloth wrapped around the soundboard. Singers practiced an art of restrained projection. Enough to weave the story's emotion, but not enough to alert the night watch. It's a bit like trying to belt out a power ballad while your roommate is asleep in the next room. Tricky, but with practice, performers learn to make it work. Historians still argue whether these underground venues laid the groundwork for what eventually became chamber opera, a more intimate, scaled-down approach that thrived in private salons. Some claim that the need to avoid hush hour laws forced composers to adapt their works to smaller spaces and quieter instrumentation, thus shaping the evolution of the art form. Others believe chamber opera was just a natural progression of music for the elite, independent of any legal crackdown. In reality, the truth may lie somewhere in between. One can see how these hush hour limitations pushed creative minds to experiment. Restrictive laws often spark innovation, especially in the arts. Tension ran high at these disguised performances. Attendees were well aware that a single wrong note, a soprano hitting a high pitch at full volume, could bring the city guard pounding on the door. You can imagine the comedic potential. A dramatic moment in the storyline calls for a high C, but the singer belts out a half-hearted falsetto to avoid detection. The lead tenor, mid-aria, glances at the conductor, who gestures frantically, lower, lower. The hushed chorus might respond so quietly that even the folks in the front row struggle to hear. It's an odd blend of adrenaline and near silence. A stealth opera, if ever there was one. Attendees had their own brand of gallows humor. One anecdote tells of an opera lover who would whisper to his neighbor, "I sure hope this final act ends before the watch's next patrol, or we'll all be singing the jailhouse blues." Another man, upon hearing footsteps outside the door, jumped up and tried to blend into the backdrop, only to crash into the makeshift scenery. The entire set toppled, nearly crushing the harpsichord. The audience had to stifle their laughter, even as the watchman's lantern glowed through the cracks of the boards. Fortunately for them, the guards seemed to mistake the commotion for a stack of barrels tipping over. Crisis averted. Beyond the comedic calamities, these hidden opera houses served a meaningful cultural purpose. They allowed for a sense of communal bonding, a rebellious camaraderie that united tailors, bakers, blacksmiths, and maybe a stray noble or two who shared the same passion for music. When you attend a secret performance in a run-down warehouse at night, you feel like part of a grand conspiracy. a living testament that art cannot be silenced by mere decrees. If hushed hour laws insisted that music stay underground, then underground it went, thriving in defiance. A fringe tidbit from an obscure city archive reveals that in one region of Central Europe, local authorities discovered a disguised opera house beneath a defunct brewery. The brew barrels in the front were genuine, musty and unused, but the enormous basement behind them had been converted into a circular performance area with surprisingly sophisticated acoustics. When the patrol finally discovered the operation, they were so impressed by the ingenuity and perhaps by the leftover hour that they reportedly imposed only a minimal fine. The magistrate's official complaint read, "While these premises are found in direct violation of hush hour, the exceptional craftsmanship and acoustical design merits a lenient penalty." Artistic innovation won a small victory that night. So, how did these disguised opera houses survive over time? Partly through generous patrons, wealthy individuals who enjoyed flouting the laws or simply loved music enough to take the risk. Sometimes, nobility themselves discreetly supported these hidden venues, entertaining the idea of being a sort of shadow sponsor. They might even attend incognito, wearing a hooded cloak, relishing the drama of being mere steps from scandal. No matter your station in life, the shared experience of secret opera had a certain allure. Eventually, as some city-states relaxed their hushed hour enforcement or updated their laws, these disguised venues became less necessary. Opera and other dramatic arts moved into legitimate theaters and grand public stages, where the chorus could finally sing out without restraint. But the legend of the hidden opera house never fully vanished. In some locales, centuries-old rumors persist about tunnels and trapdoors beneath modern buildings, left over from the days when performing by candlelight was an act of civil disobedience. Standing in the dim glow of your makeshift seat, you wait for the hush before the final act. You sense the collective breath of the audience, a hush that's both reverent for the performance and wary of detection. The conductor silently raises a baton, the small orchestra leans in, and the lead soprano prepares to deliver her concluding aria, soft as a whispered secret. In that moment, you realize that music's power doesn't always come from volume. Sometimes, it's the quiet tension, the shared risk, that electrifies the air. And hush hour or not, that's a magic no decree can extinguish. Following the glow of hidden opera houses, you drift into a quieter district, one lined with ornate balconies and winding wrought iron staircases. At first, it looks peaceful, the perfect place for an evening stroll. But beneath that calm surface lies a rich history of scandalous serenades, romantic gestures that once set tongues wagging, and occasionally entire communities on edge. You pause at a corner to take in a view of the moonlit rooftops, half expecting a shy troubadour to appear with a lute. Sure enough, you can almost see the outlines of lovers leaning over railings, whispering endearments into the still night air. Once upon a time, such serenades were anything but sweet trifles. They sparked lawsuits, fueled political vendettas, and led to some of the oddest hush-hour laws you've yet encountered. Picture a well-to-do nobleman, decked out in a puffed-sleeved shirt and embroidered vest, tiptoeing through an upscale neighborhood, ready to serenade his beloved. He positions himself below her balcony, guitar in hand, heart pounding. The hush-hour law says no loud singing after dark, but love has little respect for local statutes. The first few notes drift upward, quiet as a confession. Then, emboldened by the glow of moonlight and the thought of his sweetheart's approval, he raises his voice just enough to carry the tune. From a purely romantic perspective, this is enchanting. From a legal standpoint, it's a ticking time bomb. One overzealous watchman or disgruntled neighbor, and that dreamy ballad could morph into a court summons. In some cities, these private nighttime serenades were tolerated, sometimes even celebrated, as long as they didn't disturb too many people. But add politics into the mix, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Maybe our nobleman's sweetheart is promised to someone else, or her family has long-standing feuds with the local authorities. If so, that sweet balcony scene might balloon into a major scandal. The family of the betrothed storms out, crying foul play. The local magistrate rushes in, citing hush hour. Neighbors gather at windows, scandalized but thrilled by the drama. Within days, the entire neighborhood is abuzz with rumors. Did you hear? Count so. And so tried to abduct the baron's daughter with a scandalous serenade. It sounds exaggerated, but historians still argue whether these incidents were truly common, or just the stuff of local law. Certainly, enough written testimonies survived to confirm that a single serenade could light the fuse on a broader conflict. One mainstream historical fact in Renaissance Italy, public singing after sundown became so controversial in certain cities states that officials issued specific permits for nighttime serenades. These permits dictated how many musicians could participate, what instruments were allowed, and how long the performance could last. In some places, you had to pay a handsome fee just to sing under a balcony, which, ironically, might bankrupt you before you even had the chance to impress your beloved. As you walk deeper into this story, imagine the comedic angles. One anecdote tells of a young suitor who couldn't afford the official permit, but decided to serenade anyway. He chose a comedic tune, figuring the local guard might be more lenient if it was something light-hearted rather than a full-throated love aria. Unfortunately, his comedic stylings woke half the block. The outraged father emerged wielding a chamber pot, dumping its contents onto the hapless singer. The guard arrived seconds later, slipping on the puddle. Instead of arresting anyone, he spent the next hour trying to regain his dignity, while the father and the suitor shouted accusations at each other. The poor beloved watched the entire fiasco from her balcony, absolutely mortified. So much for a romantic midnight memory. Sometimes, these serenades escalated into genuine political drama. Maybe an ambitious lord saw a chance to weaken a rival by encouraging his own knights to conduct a noisy serenade near the rival's home. Deliberately breaking hush hour, the watchers pounced, handing out fines and tarnishing the rival's reputation for controlling his men. In a world where honor and alliances mattered, such a move could tip the balance of power in local councils. Indeed, a small bedroom window performance might cause ripples that reached the grandest chambers of City Hall. One fringe tidbit from the annals of a Swiss canton recounts a bizarre scenario where the local watch accused a serenading group of being political agitators. The newly appointed bailiff claimed their love songs contained hidden messages urging rebellion, while the lyrics were presumably just romantic fluff, praising the lady's eyes and hair. The bailiff insisted the lines were code for inciting an uprising. The entire group was hauled before a council. Though they were eventually released for lack of evidence, the hushed hour ordinances were tightened. That marked the start of a bizarre chapter in which even mild compliments about someone's radiant eyes were seen as potential code words. That's a tall order for anyone looking to charm a sweetheart. Of course, romantic serenades weren't limited to aristocrats and their star-crossed dramas. Common folk, too, tried their luck at dusk. For a miller's apprentice or a merchant's son, singing to a sweetheart under a thatched window might be the only grand gesture they could afford. But hush hour laws didn't discriminate between noble and commoner. If you were caught singing, you'd face the same wrath. That gave rise to comedic attempts at stealth serenades. A singer crouched behind a rain barrel, belting lyrics at a barely audible whisper. Or a pair of lovers who choreographed a whole routine. He'd whistle a line of melody. She'd respond with a muffled harmony from the window, each no louder than a hum. It may have looked more like a game of charades than a heartfelt love song. Yet, necessity is the mother of invention, especially when the penalty might be a humiliating appearance before the city elders. Some areas enacted a curious workaround. Rather than outright forbid serenades, they imposed a twilight window limit, stating that any open window or balcony was fair game for the watch to target if noise emanated from it after the official hush hour. In effect, you could sing if you kept your shutters sealed. Picture a suitor singing into a closed wooden shutter, the beloved inside straining to catch every note. Not exactly the romantic starlit moment you'd hope for, but it beat incurring the local sheriff's ire. Naturally, a handful of these serenades ended in genuine scandal, shaping local law for generations. Maybe a powerful bishop's niece ran off with a gifted but penniless troubadour, culminating in a hush-hour chase through torchlit alleys. Or perhaps a highborn daughter got caught signaling a secret suitor through coded lyrics, leading to a family feud that escalated into pitched arguments in the city council. In such cases, hush-hour laws often tightened in the aftermath, as officials cited moral decay and public inconvenience to justify cracking down on nighttime music. If you can't trust people to behave themselves, the reasoning went, better to silence them entirely. Historians continue to unearth documents that reveal the far-reaching consequences of these hush-hour serenade scandals. Some might dismiss them as small-town drama, others see them as windows into the cultural fabric of the time, where personal romance could swiftly become public business, and music was both a pleasure and a battleground. You can't help but crack a smile at how something as wholesome as a love song could spark so much chaos. There's a certain charm in imagining a dedicated suitor, guitar in hand, heart on his sleeve, only to have the city guard chase him off, as if he were a cat burglar. This legacy lingers in odd corners of modern Europe, where ancient bylaws about nighttime disturbances still exist on the books. Rarely enforced, they nonetheless stand as remnants of an era when a simple serenade could tip the scales of love, politics, and social order. So, as you wander these streets tonight, keep one ear open for an echo of those old ballads. Maybe someone, somewhere, is still risking a hushed hour violation for the sake of romance. If so, tip your hat to them. Because in a world that once equated singing with subversion, every stolen note is a quiet victory for the heart. By the time you venture across modern European landscapes, it's easy to assume that those old hush hour bands are long gone. Distant relics from a time when monarchs, church choirs, and petty lords ruled the night, but you'd be surprised how many of those archaic, note-singing rules remain quietly etched into local legislation. You stroll through a picturesque village in the Swiss Alps, or maybe a charming coastal town in Portugal, only to discover that certain lines in the municipal code still restrict nighttime vocals or public serenades after sundown. The law might not be enforced, but it's there, like an old ghost waiting to be called upon, if someone really wants to stir trouble. Take the comedic case of a traveling a cappella group that planned an impromptu performance in a quaint French hamlet. One evening, they gathered in the square, harmonizing softly under the stars. Suddenly, a middle-aged man, hair disheveled, wearing slippers, stormed out of a nearby cottage, brandishing a 19th-century local ordinance. It read something along the lines of, "No unauthorized singing on the streets post Twilight." The travelers were baffled. They glanced around at the peaceful setting. No watchman in sight, no city guard brandishing pikes. Yet here was an indignant resident, citing a dusty law like it was brand new. Ultimately, the group apologized and relocated to a friendlier spot. But the moment stuck with them, a comical reminder that old rules can lurk like landmines. Historians still argue whether these neglected bands survive simply due to bureaucratic oversight. Nobody bothered to repeal them, or if certain communities keep them on the books for symbolic reasons. Perhaps they cherish the historical quirkiness, using it to preserve a sense of local identity. After all, who doesn't love a good story about how, technically, you can't whistle a lullaby here past 8 p.m.? On the other hand, some communities might feel these archaic statutes provide a fallback option. If a rowdy festival or an overly enthusiastic busker becomes a nuisance, local officials can dust off the hush hour rule and lay down the law. One mainstream historical fact involves the Napoleonic Code, introduced during Napoleon Bonaparte's rule in the early 19th century. While it revolutionized legal systems across Europe, many local or regional statutes, especially those dealing with petty matters like singing after dark, were never fully integrated or abolished. This patchwork legacy means that pockets of strange legalese remained hidden between modern civil codes. Over the centuries, administrators would occasionally stumble across them, scratch their heads, and sometimes just leave them in place out of inertia. A fringe tidbit emerges from a Welsh village's municipal records. It seems the bylaw forbids songful utterances, from the falling of dusk to the crowing of the cock, a phrase that conjures images of medieval halberdiers patrolling cobblestone streets. Local law claims the rule was originally enacted to curb late, night drinking songs in the local tavern. However, folks also whisper that it had a more bizarre origin. The village mayor's wife loathed the sound of a particular traveling bard who kept showing up each summer to sing near their garden. Whether that's fact or fancy is anyone's guess, but the archaic wording remains a source of amusement for any modern solicitor who stumbles upon it. Every so often, a tourist innocently triggers these dormant laws. Picture a backpacker wandering into a sleepy Italian hill town. Charmed by the moonlit piazza, he strums a guitar to serenade the moment, unaware of any hush hour rule. Suddenly, a local official approaches. Maybe not with a sword, but with a stern lecture or a polite request to stop. The traveler's confusion is complete. Is this for real? You can imagine the comedic exchange as the official points to a line in a century-old code. The traveler blinks in disbelief, and the small crowd that's gathered half laughs, half shakes their head at the weirdness of tradition clashing with modern life. In some communities, folks have embraced these outdated, no-singing rules as an opportunity for tourism. They promote haunted hush hour tours, leading visitors through dimly lit streets while recounting tales of medieval watchmen and secret lullabies. The guide might wave a lantern, telling stories of how certain corners were once notorious for stealth serenades. Then, at the end of the tour, the guide lowers their voice conspiratorially. And remember, if you break into song right now, you're technically an outlaw. Cue nervous giggles from tourists who aren't sure if the law is jokingly suspended for them or not. But there's also a serious edge to this phenomenon. In certain places, particularly where conflicts or tensions still run high, local authorities might resurrect an old hush hour statute to quell protests or gatherings. Even if the original law never intended to block political speech, it can be twisted to serve that purpose. Suddenly, a rally featuring chants or songs after dusk finds itself labeled as illegal under a centuries-old bylaw. It's a stark reminder that archaic regulations, left on the books, can become instruments of modern control. One comedic instance turned darker when a group of environmental activists singing protest songs near a seaside port was slapped with an antiquated hush-hour fine. Their reaction? They turned the citation into a badge of honor, distributing copies at their next demonstration. The local council eventually had to back down amid public outcry, but not before the unusual incident made headlines. Historians still debate whether these lingering hush-hour rules are best seen as charming vestiges of the past or as potential tools for abuse. One camp argues that, since they're rarely enforced and mostly archaic, they pose no real threat, just a dash of color for the local story. Another camp insists that all outdated laws should be systematically reviewed and repealed to prevent any unscrupulous official from weaponizing them. Both positions have merit. After all, laws, by definition, come with the power to punish. Do we really want to preserve that power for rules written when people believe bird calls at twilight could summon witches? And then there's the comedic scenario where a local historical society steps in to protect the hush-hour clause as a cultural artifact. "It's part of our heritage!" they might argue, passionately citing parchment documents from the 1400s. Meanwhile, the town's youth shake their heads, longing for open mic nights without needing to check the clock. In some cases, these tensions become a flashpoint in city council meetings. Picture a grey-haired historian in a tweed jacket passionately reciting medieval statutes, while a local band pleads for the right to perform an unplugged set under the stars. It's an odd spectacle that underscores how the past and present can clash when it comes to what we're allowed to do at night. Yet, for all the awkwardness, there's a nostalgic charm to the idea that somewhere, hidden in the legal code, is a rule forbidding you from warbling a tune once the sun goes down. It's like a window into a bygone world, one where candlelit curfews and roving watchmen were the norm, and songs at twilight held a faint whiff of danger. In a way, these modern echoes remind us that history isn't always a neatly sealed chapter. Sometimes, it trickles into the present, shaping behaviors in subtle, unexpected ways. As you reflect on these lingering laws, you might spot a friendly local humming softly outside a cafe, well past dusk. You exchange a knowing smile, half expecting someone to jump out of a bush, with a relic scroll forbidding even that humble melody. But no one does. The hum continues, weaving through the warm night air, a quiet testament to the resilience of music, and the general disregard for the more absurd rules from our past. Because yes, those archaic hush-hour bands might still exist, but the human spirit finds a way to sing on regardless. And while you take comfort in that, the small thrill of breaking the rules, even the outdated ones, might just make your evening hum all the more satisfying. In a world brimming with glossy travel guides and digital itineraries, it's easy to assume you've got every local quirk covered before you hop off the tour bus, but then you land in a sleepy European hamlet, charming timbered houses, cobblestone lanes, a postcard-perfect sunset, and discover that singing a gentle lullaby after dusk could land you in hot water. You blink in confusion, glancing around as if the local townsfolk must be pulling your leg. But no, those hush-hour rules you've skimmed in the guidebook's tiny footnote are real, and they can baffle even the most seasoned traveler. Picture yourself as a backpacker with a penchant for spontaneous fun. You've spent the day exploring medieval ruins, sampling local pastries, and snapping pictures of centuries-old architecture. Evening rolls around, and a friendly group you've just met suggests gathering by a scenic overlook to share travel stories. Someone strums a borrowed guitar, and you all launch into a soft rendition of a well-known folk tune, something harmless to set the mood. Suddenly, an elderly resident shuffles by, wagging a finger with surprising vigor. No singing after sundown, she warns, her voice as gravelly as the cobblestones. Half laughing, half embarrassed, you lower the volume, unsure if she's joking or dead serious. Spoiler alert, she's serious. This kind of twilight confusion crops up in unexpected ways. It might be a local festival you've read about, advertised with bright posters that promise music and dancing. But if you read the fine print, there's an end time strictly enforced once dusk hits. A security volunteer hustles people off the streets. politely but firmly reminding them that the festival's license doesn't cover any singing beyond a certain hour. You'd assume these rules are ancient history, but they persist, popping out like a jump scare for unsuspecting visitors. Historians still argue whether these old no-singing statutes hamper modern tourism or, ironically, attract curious travelers. Some claim that travelers flock to these quirky towns for the novelty of the place where humming might be illegal. Others believe such anachronistic laws create friction that leaves tourists feeling unwelcome. A mainstream historical fact might provide perspective. The Grand Tour tradition of the 17th and 18th centuries saw young aristocrats traveling across Europe to absorb culture, art and music. Yet even back then, certain travelers wrote exasperated letters home about local hush-hour bands, complaining they couldn't enjoy local concerts or spontaneous street performances once the lanterns were lit. So, in a sense, this culture clash is nothing new. Modern tour guides do their best to brief you on the major highlights, like the region's scenic viewpoints and hidden culinary gems. But seldom do they warn you in bold letters. By the way, don't break into song after 9 p.m. So you can imagine the comedic chaos that ensues when a group of cheerful tourists, maybe fresh from a wine tasting, decides to belt out show tunes under a glowing lamppost. One anecdote floating around the traveler community is about a choir on a European tour who performed in a grand cathedral by day, only to get fined at night for rehearsing a cappella hymns in the streets. The choristers were dumbfounded. Apparently, you can raise the roof in a formal concert, but once you're off stage and the clock strikes hush hour, even a quiet snippet of Alleluia is off limits. Of course, these run-ins aren't always negative. Sometimes the local authorities have a sense of humor, or at least a sense of perspective. A comedic scenario: an Italian policeman spots a group of Belgian tourists warbling pop songs near a fountain after dark. He approaches, looking stern, and the tourists freeze mid, note like startled deer. Then, in halting English, the officer says, "As good singing, but too late. 5 minutes more, then hush." Everyone breathes a sigh of relief, politely wraps up the tune and disbands with laughter. Crisis averted. Not all encounters end so amicably. A fringe tidbit emerges from a small northern European town where unsuspecting visitors were once slapped with a bizarre penalty. Instead of a straightforward fine, the local code demanded that offenders perform civic duties at dawn. That might mean scrubbing graffiti or cleaning a communal courtyard. For a wide-eyed tourist looking for an authentic experience, that's a bit more cultural immersion than they bargained for. Imagine wandering back to your hostel at midnight, only to discover you have to wake at 5 a.m. to pay off your singing debt with a mop and broom. Tensions can also arise when tourists mistake local festivals for free-for-alls. Some regions celebrate harvest or midsummer events, featuring daytime parades and vibrant musical acts. Excited travelers assume the party continues after sundown. After all, who stops partying when the moon's out? But hush-hour laws are hush-hour laws, so the music abruptly halts, leaving baffled visitors in the silent streets, still buzzing with leftover energy. Like a sudden power cut at a rock concert, the hush is jarring. Many react with confusion or frustration. Wait, that's it. Where'd the band go? Only then does a local, seeing their puzzled faces, whisper, "The hush hour started." The band had to stop. The tourists exchange disbelieving glances, half convinced this must be a prank. Sometimes local businesses turn this quirk to their advantage. In a classic stroke of entrepreneurial brilliance, a small bar might advertise, "Hush Hour Karaoke," handing out headphones and letting patrons quietly sing along to tracks only they can hear. Imagine a half-dozen travelers, each belting a different tune under their breath, bobbing in near silence while onlookers witness a bizarre pantomime. It looks more like a modern silent disco than a typical karaoke night. But hey, if it avoids fines and entertains the crowd, why not? Not all travelers find it charming. Some feel resentful, especially if they've come from a place where late-night music is a cultural norm. Think Spain's flamenco bars or Ireland's lively pubs. Suddenly, they're in a region where even mild humming can bring a reprimand. Cultural shock sets in, leading them to question how a community can uphold such outdated rules. Locals might shrug and say, "It's tradition," or "We value our peace." Tourists might retort, "But doesn't it hamper your nightlife?" The debate unfolds, fueling yet another chapter in the long saga of hush-hour controversies. But if you ask the quiet corners of these towns, like the family who's used to going to bed early, or the elderly resident who treasures silence, they might argue these rules protect a cherished way of life. They'll recount stories of how the hushed hour fosters calm after a day of bustling commerce, ensuring restful nights for hardworking folks. They might even point out that local families have a tradition of telling bedtime stories or reciting poems in hushed voices, carrying on a cultural heritage that thrives in stillness rather than in loud communal revelry. Historians still debate whether hush hour laws truly reflect a deep, seated cultural preference for peace, or if they're simply relics enforced out of habit. And travelers, stepping into this puzzle, become either accidental rebels or bemused observers. Some adapt quickly. You'll spot them whispering songs in hostile courtyards or playing instruments in near-mute mode. Others bristle and complain, threatening to leave a bad review on some travel forum. But often, if they stick around, they discover something quietly magical. When a town collectively shushes itself at night, it reveals a tapestry of subtle sounds, rustling leaves, distant owls, murmured conversation through open windows. Paradoxically, this hush can be an unforgettable auditory experience in its own right. So, you stand at the edge of a stone bridge, the moonlight reflecting off the water below. Two travelers lean against the railing low-key singing some slow ballad they both love. Their voices are soft, blending with the sound of the current. A local passes-by, notices how subdued and respectful they're being, and simply nods in acknowledgement. That's the unspoken compromise between visitor and community. You can share a tune, but keep it gentle, keep it faint. It's a far cry from the typical party till dawn tourism some might expect, but it holds its own charm. And as you walk away, humming quietly, you realize you're part of that hush hour mosaic. An outsider who's learned to navigate these curious, singing laws without losing the simple joy of song. You stroll through another fog-wreathed lane, footsteps echoing on moist cobblestones, and notice a small group of uniformed individuals huddled beneath a flickering torch. They look like any ordinary patrol, cloaks, boots, a few grumpy faces. But there's something distinct about them. One holds a list, another seems to have a small horn or whistle at the ready, and you can't help but feel like you've just stumbled upon Europe's music police. These were the folks tasked, centuries ago, with rooting out illegal singing, ensuring hush, hour compliance, and maintaining a nightly lull that extended far beyond ordinary curfews. You half expect them to turn around and hiss. No humming, no whistling, no fun. Just to confirm your suspicions. They were more properly known as municipal music inspectors or noise wardens in some places, but among locals, they picked up less flattering nicknames. Sing snuffers, chorus killers, or the Hush Squad. Their mission was straightforward: roam the streets at twilight and crack down on any tuneful activity that might break the hushed hour laws. You might guess that these were just glorified watchmen, but sources suggest a surprising level of specialization. Some actually carried rudimentary pitch pipes, presumably to prove a melody was in progress if they caught someone mid-verse. Can you imagine a stern official blowing a note, then listening with a practiced ear to see if you match the pitch? The comedic potential is huge. Rumor has it that in one German principality, these music police had daily rehearsals, so they could identify specific intervals, like a detective training to sniff out contraband. If you belted a scale in the wrong place at the wrong hour, they'd pounce, brandishing their official scrolls. Legend says they even coded different fines based on your pitch accuracy. Off-key warblers were considered an even greater offense, perhaps for adding insult to injury. Was it real policy, or just local hearsay? Historians still argue whether such pitch-focused enforcement ever truly existed, or if it's just a tall tale woven by townsfolk who loved mocking authority. One mainstream historical fact: certain large cities, especially in the Renaissance era, employed specialized functionaries whose job was to regulate street performers and ensure civic order. In Venice, for example, you'd find a range of officials tasked with policing everything from gondolier behavior to traveling entertainers. They might not have been called music police outright, but their function was similar, maintaining the peace and punishing unauthorized performances, especially at night when the canals echoed sound more dramatically. The problem was, Venice thrived on music and spectacle, so it was a constant push and pull between city traditions and official crackdown. Elsewhere, these musical watchdogs showed up in surprising forms. A fringe tidbit from a small Swedish town details how a single choirmaster was deputized to monitor any illicit singing after Sunday's evening service. Why a choirmaster, of all people? The local mayor reasoned that he'd be best at identifying real singing versus random shouting or a noisy cat. But the arrangement quickly grew farcical. The choirmaster, conflicted about punishing people for making music, often turned a blind eye to borderline offenses. When confronted by the mayor, he'd shrug. It was just a bird. My ears must be getting rusty. Eventually, the mayor gave up on the experiment. The choir master resumed his day job of teaching psalms, and the hushed hour laws remained mostly unenforced, at least by him. You might be picturing gruff men with thick mustaches and large hats, prowling in pairs, shining lanterns into corners to catch an errant minstrel. And honestly, you wouldn't be far off. But the role took many shapes. In some regions, the music police were part of a guild system themselves, like a sub-guild of watchmen who specialized in noise violations. They kept logs of repeat offenders, documented which songs were causing the biggest uproar, and sometimes even offered hush licenses for a fee. If you paid a tidy sum, you might get permission to host a small Twilight choir at your home. It's a classic money, make it create a problem, then sell the solution. Naturally, corruption crept in. There's a comedic tale of a traveling troubadour who arrived in a Flemish city, only to be cornered by a music warden demanding an immediate bribe. If the troubadour refused, the warden threatened to blow his whistle and claim he heard an illegal serenade. The troubadour, short on funds, suggested an alternative. "I'll write you your own personal ballad, praising your noble diligence." The flattered warden agreed, only to discover the ballad was loaded with tongue-in cheek jabs about a man whose ears are so big he can hear a note before it's sung. By the time he realized the insult, the troubadour had already left town. At least the hush hour remained unbroken, aside from that one sarcastic ballad. Sometimes, the music police joined forces with religious authorities. In areas where the church heavily influenced local governance, the hush hour was presented as a moral imperative. Quiet at night, so souls can rest and remain pure. Thus, patrolling for nighttime singers became akin to patrolling for sin. Historians still debate whether these alliances between civic and religious watchmen stemmed more from genuine piety or a power grab. After all, controlling a population's expression, even something as innocent as singing, can be a potent way to keep them in line. Of course, the watchers themselves faced pushback. Some communities viewed them as busybodies who overstepped their mandate. Others simply saw them as necessary evils in an age when petty crime flourished after sundown. If a scuffle broke out in a tavern at midnight, the music police could intervene, though comedic accounts suggest they sometimes had trouble distinguishing a fistfight from an impromptu folk dance. The line between rhythmic stomping and brawling can blur in the wee hours, especially if the participants are well into their cups. Then there's the question of how these officials dealt with animals. Roosters crow at dawn, dogs bark at the moon, cats yowl in alleyways. Did these untrained creatures count as hush hour violators? Some documents reveal exasperated attempts by local councils to penalize owners of noisy animals, but it rarely stuck. You can't exactly jail a rooster, so the watchers often ended up focusing on human offenders, to somewhat comedic effect. Imagine ignoring a cat in heat, shrieking at 2 a.m., while nabbing a half-asleep farmer humming a lullaby in his barn. Priorities. One might wonder how the watchers identified themselves. In a few older cities, they wore badges, sashes, or special hats signifying their authority to hush you up. That alone became a source of mockery. Comedic poems from the era lampooned the Tin Air Patrol, suggesting they had such terrible taste in music that they wanted to ban it for everyone else. And yet, some watchers genuinely loved music. They just insisted it happen at sanctioned times. Imagine a warden who spent his off hours practicing a lute, carefully abiding by the local hush hour, all while handing out fines by days or evening to people who sang without a permit. Hypocrisy or just duty? Hard to say. Over time, most of these specialized roles faded into the general watch or local police force. As Europe modernized, street lighting improved, and new forms of entertainment replaced casual singing in public spaces. Still, the legacy lingers. Now and then, you'll hear of a small town designating a noise control officer, drawing parallels to those old music police. The modern version might be more about decibel meters and less about pitch pipes, but the ethos is oddly familiar. For all their earnestness, these watchdogs rarely succeeded in snuffing out music entirely. Humans have an irrepressible urge to sing, hum, whistle, or tap a rhythm on a tavern table. If anything, official crackdowns only fueled creativity. People found quieter ways to share tunes, hidden venues to belt them out, or coded signals to keep the watchers guessing. You sense that the watchers themselves knew the futility of their job, but a paycheck is a paycheck, and local lords liked showing they were doing something. About nighttime noise. So here you stand, glancing at the cloaked figures with their lantern and ledger, pondering a centuries-old question: can you really silence music? Even if the watchers chase off every minstrel, clamp down on every lullaby, and levy fines on every off-key troubadour, the melody finds a way. It seeps through shutters, flows in hushed living rooms, or gets carried by the breeze from hidden courtyards. Like water through cracks, music is unstoppable. And as the night air brushes your cheeks, you can't resist humming under your breath, just to feel that small electric thrill of defying the hush hour watchers. If only by a single note. You linger in a cramped library chamber, barely lit by flickering candles that leave dancing shadows on rows of battered tomes. Around you, a handful of earnest scholars pore over ancient parchments, each claiming to reveal the true origins of Europe's hush hour laws. It's like stepping onto a battlefield where the weapon of choice is dusty legal text, not swords or pikes. You clear your throat quietly. Wouldn't want to risk violating some antiquated code for excessive throat clearing after dusk, and pull up a seat, prepared to witness a parade of conflicting theories and half-baked conjectures. The first scholar, a stern-looking woman in wire-framed spectacles, points to a line in a 13th century municipal charter. She insists that hush hour originated purely as a crime prevention tool. Robbers and rogues thrived in the cover of darkness. She explains, tapping her parchment. By banning nighttime singing, the authorities made it easier to hear suspicious activity. No melodic distraction means townsfolk can be on high alert. This logic, you admit, sounds plausible. After all, if a band of thieves is scaling city walls, the guard might notice them more readily if the streets aren't filled with rowdy songs and banging drums. But at the far end of the table, a second scholar scoffs. It's not about crime, he counters. It's about religious dominance and moral order. With a flourish, he produces a different set of documents. Sermons from the late Middle Ages, in which priests denounce heathen tunes and nocturnal temptations. According to him, hushed hour laws sprang from ecclesiastical pressure, ensuring people would either be asleep or attending night prayers, rather than indulging in bawdy ballads. Don't forget, he says, the church was incredibly powerful. If they wanted a quiet night to cultivate reflection and prayer, who was going to argue? From another corner, a third scholar, half buried under a stack of scrolls, chimes in. Historians still argue whether hush hour was a top-down tactic to curb potential rebellions. Think about it. If commoners gather at twilight singing rousing songs, it's a breeding ground for dissent. By silencing them, feudal lords or city councils could keep the populace docile. He waves a pamphlet depicting an 18th century caricature of a revolution inspired by a tavern sing along. The image shows pitchfork-wielding peasants marching to a lively tune, presumably plotting an uprising. You can't deny the logic. Get rid of the nightly communal gatherings, and you eliminate a potential catalyst for subversive talk. In truth, you suspect each theory holds a kernel of truth. After all, hush hour laws likely served multiple functions. They cut down on crime, indulged religious leaders who disapproved of merrymaking, and conveniently stifled any rebellious rumblings that might crescendo under the cover of night. Each group benefited from a quiet populace, so the alliances formed easily, and the laws stuck around for centuries. One mainstream historical fact emerges as you flip through a thick chronicle, the 1219 statutes from the city of Toulouse, which explicitly forbid nighttime tumult, singing, and musical amusements in public squares. According to the margin notes, the city's officials justified it as a way to maintain public tranquility and deter conspiracies. You find it telling that in the same breath, they mention both tranquility and conspiracies, as if the two are inevitably linked. It's a small but telling snapshot of hush hour's multiple motives. Over at another table, a quiet scholar beckons you closer, whispering about a fringe tidbit. Rumor has it that certain hush hour laws started as secret guidelines among paranoid aristocrats who believed that witches and shape-shifters used nightly singing to cast spells. This paranoid angle might sound ludicrous now, but back in an era when people genuinely feared dark sorcery, a note-singing rule could be framed as a method to prevent unholy rites. The scholar shows you a bizarre woodcut of hooded figures chanting in a moonlit clearing. Of course, she adds with a wink, we don't have concrete evidence that hush hour was officially about witch hunts, but suspicion was enough to support a law that kept singing to a minimum. Historians still debate the degree to which fear of the supernatural, as opposed to fear of real-world threats, shaped Europe's hush hour mania. Some argue that local communities combined the two. If unholy gatherings or criminals were going to lurk in the dark, might as well stamp out all forms of nighttime noise to catch them more easily. Others roll their eyes, suggesting it's all revisionist sensationalism. But as you skim medieval diaries that mention neighbors suspecting each other of midnight chants, you can't dismiss the idea entirely. human beings have always been complicated, mixing rational concerns with a dash of the fantastical. You also see references to ancient city councils imposing hush hour for purely practical reasons. Medieval homes were largely timber, prone to catastrophic fires sparked by lamp flames or cooking hearths left unattended. A rowdy night of song could become a rowdy night of drunken mishaps. And drunken mishaps could lead to flame-ups that destroyed entire neighborhoods. Bank your fires and keep your voice down. Thus served as a combined measure, minimal activity after dark meant fewer accidents. Was that the real impetus, or just another side benefit? The scholars at this table disagree, arms folded, eyebrows raised. One comedic anecdote surfaces as you leaf through a dusty volume on Scottish burgh laws. A local legend recounts how one town set hush hour not out of fear of criminals or witches, but simply to help local bagpipers perfect their craft in daylight only, lest their nighttime wailing offend the laird's delicate ears. Over time, that no bagpipes after dusk rule morphed into a blanket ban on all forms of singing. The story might be apocryphal, but it captures the chaotic layering of reasons that hush hour laws came into being. Maybe it started as a personal vendetta against a single instrument, then ballooned into a sweeping statute. Stepping back, you realize that hush hour was never a monolith. Even within the same kingdom, one city's rationale might hinge on preventing fires, while another's might revolve around moral discipline. A few miles away, it could be about thwarting conspiracies or scaring off witches. Over centuries, these motives blended into a kaleidoscope of local ordinances, each claiming legitimacy. Then, as time marched on, the reasons got murkier, and people simply followed the law. Because it's always been done. Historians still argue whether hush hour was mostly about societal control or genuine communal good. Even modern interpretations clash. Was hush hour a medieval attempt at safeguarding mental health, ensuring folks got enough sleep in an era without electric lights? Or was it an authoritarian measure that stifled creativity and suppressed freedom of assembly? Read one historian's take, and hush hour is basically a nightmarish muzzle on personal expression. Read another's, and it's an early version of a noise ordinance meant to keep peace in crowded, flammable cities. Amid these tangled theories, the only certainty is that hush hour left a massive imprint on European culture. It shaped daily schedules, influenced the design of homes and public squares, spurred clandestine music scenes, and fueled centuries of comedic or tragic anecdotes. Whether you see it as a paternalistic stranglehold or a prudent curfew policy, hush hour still echoes through modern times, both in the form of outdated laws on the books and in the deeply ingrained sense that nighttime belongs to quiet reflection rather than raucous celebration. As you close the final parchment and blow out a guttering candle, you can almost hear the cacophony of centuries swirling in your ears, the arguments of lords and priests, the conspiratorial murmurs of revolutionaries, the soft chanting of witches, real or imagined, and the pitched battles of bagpipers versus local lairds. All that debate, all that fuss over weather and when people should sing once the sun goes down, it's enough to make your head spin. Yet, stepping outside into the starry night, you feel more grounded than ever. Because, in the hush that follows, the echo of all these voices reminds you, while theories tangle and laws fade, the human impulse for nighttime song remains. A gentle refrain that defies every attempt to hush it for good. The Twilight hush has been the star of our journey, lurking in medieval villages, echoing through royal courts, and hiding in the dusty archives of local laws. Now, as you wander these final steps, you can't help but see how this centuries-long dance of bannings and breaking nighttime singing has quietly shaped Europe's cultural identity. The fact that a simple tune at dusk could become a symbol of defiance, piety, or civic order reveals just how deeply this hushed hour legacy has woven itself into the continent's psyche. You might ask, are we really influenced by rules that most of us have never seen actively enforced? Surprisingly, yes, even if few modern Europeans have ever been cited for humming a lullaby under the moon. The attitudes that once fueled hush hour laws linger in everyday customs. Consider how many European towns still settle into near silence after a certain hour. Shops close early, streets empty, and folks retreat behind warm lamplight. Partly that's due to tradition and respect for neighbors, but it also echoes a long-standing norm: nighttime is private time. Whether it sprang from fear of fire, worry over bandits, or moral guardianship, the habit of quiet evenings persists. When traveling through these regions, you'll notice that many place a premium on what could be called communal respect. For instance, in Switzerland, it's still frowned upon to make too much racket after 10 p.m. Many buildings have rules about not running the laundry machine late at night, or keeping conversations hushed in shared corridors. One mainstream historical fact: local Swiss ordinances trace their roots back to formal peace and order laws from the 15th century, which regulated times for trading, feasting, and yes, singing, while modern guidelines don't specifically mention no crooning after the second toll. The spirit of hush hour resonates in these communal norms. Elsewhere, you can spot how hush hour shaped architecture and urban planning. Streets in older sections of European cities are famously narrow, buildings pressed so close that any nighttime conversation might carry far. Over time, some communities developed thick walls and smaller windows to keep out sound. People might jokingly say, "We built our walls thick to survive winter." But that same design also muffled clandestine lullabies. Historians still argue whether hush hour restrictions were a major factor in these construction trends. Some claim the cities just adapted to climate and population growth, while others see a deliberate effort to contain noise. It's a debate that probably won't be settled soon. Even the way festivals and public celebrations are structured carries hush hour's legacy. Modern Europe is brimming with cultural events. Harvest fairs, carnival parades, music festivals. Yet you'll often find strict cut-off times. Fireworks might end by midnight or earlier. Stage performances often wrap up so local residents can enjoy peace. Admittedly, that's part courtesy and part municipal ordinance, but it also channels a centuries-old notion that the night belongs to rest, not revelry. A quirky tidbit from a small Belgian town: they hold an annual silent disco fest to avoid violating local noise laws. Attendees dance with wireless headphones, partying late into the night, while the neighbors hear nothing but the shuffle of footsteps. When you peer at today's hush hour rules, some still on the books, they seem harmless or even comedic dusty proclamations that remain for tradition's sake rather than active enforcement. But they reflect a deeper continuity. People joke about archaic laws. Don't sing to your donkey after dark. Yet those same laws once played a serious role in shaping behavior. The hush hour constraints taught communities to self-regulate, forging a culture that values courtesy and respite. Of course, whether that courtesy was cultivated by choice or imposed by threat of punishment is another matter entirely. If you talk to modern Europeans, especially older generations, you'll find a common refrain: enjoy a bit of peace in the evenings. That might be a direct echo of hush hour traditions, or simply a universal desire for rest after a busy day. Yet the comedic extremes from centuries past still bubble up in local tales. Who hasn't chuckled at the idea of watchmen prowling for off-key troubadours, or traveling friars forced to chant in whispers? These stories, half legend, half fact, remind people of a time when everyday life was governed by more than personal preference. There was a communal sense of how the evening should unfold. On the flip side, hush hour constraints shape rebellious streaks too. There's a certain romanticism in the notion of hush, defying singers or clandestine opera houses. A legacy that resonates with anyone who's ever longed to bend the rules. To this day, Europe cherishes its bohemian corners, the places where nighttime music spills onto the streets, flamenco taverns in Spain, open-air jazz clubs in France, late-night techno in Germany. A part of that vibrancy might owe itself to centuries of resisting or circumventing hush hour constraints. Creativity thrives under pressure, and hush hour was nothing if not pressure. Historians still debate the net impact. Did these restrictions stifle musical development, or did they ironically spur innovation? After all, as you learned, smaller-scale operas, hushed chanting, and secret serenades forced musicians to explore new forms and techniques. Maybe hush hour even contributed to the fine art of performing softly, like an early version of unplugged sets. Or maybe it just made life harder for would-be troubadours. The jury remains split, as it so often does when peering into the murk of the past. Modern technology adds another layer. You might think hush hour is irrelevant in an era of soundproof windows, headphones, and 24-hour entertainment streamed directly to your phone. Yet, ironically, noise complaints persist, and local councils still wrestle with how to ensure peace after dark. The principle behind hush hour, protecting people's right to quiet, resonates more than ever in crowded urban centers. Sure, we don't have watchmen with lanterns prowling the streets, but we do have neighborhood associations, city ordinances, and phone lines dedicated to reporting excessive noise. The policing may be less dramatic, but it hasn't vanished. In some places, hush hour has transformed into an almost spiritual notion of nighttime mindfulness. A few communities champion official, quiet hours, encouraging residents to dim lights and reduce sound. They argue that in an always-on world, reclaiming hush can be a blessing, helping people reconnect with a sense of calm. Whether this is hush hour by choice or by top-down decree is another question entirely, but it's clear the concept endures, albeit in gentler forms. From your vantage point here at the close of our journey, you can see hush hour as a continuous thread in Europe's tapestry, alternately comedic, oppressive, or quietly beneficial. It shaped architecture, community bonds, cultural evolution, and even the rebellious arts that thrived in its shadow. Today, as we gently slip into the modern night, the hush hour mania of old might seem distant. But if you wander a silent street in a small town, notice how the hush feels oddly sacred, as though countless generations have willed the darkness to be tranquil. In that moment, you sense hush hour's legacy more keenly than any dusty law could convey. The truth is, hush hour tapped into something primal, a shared human desire to find rest under the stars, balanced by the equally strong desire to sing to them. The tension between these urges, silence versus song, gave rise to rules, rebellions, and comedic standoffs we've explored at length. And now, here you are, with the moon high overhead and the faint hush of night pressing in, deciding for yourself how to carry this legacy forward. Will you treasure the stillness? Will you hum your own secret tune? Either way, the choice is yours, fitting testament to the centuries of hushed hour that led us here. Gradually, the pace slows. You step away from the centuries of dusty scrolls and winding alleyways, letting your mind drift into the softer rhythms of evening. Inhale that gentle hush, that lull that seems to cradle every thought in velvet calm. Allow any lingering questions to melt into the background, replaced by the steady pulse of your own heartbeat, reminding you that you're here, present, and at ease. All around, the hush of night unfurls like a comforting blanket, and you picture soft candlelight dancing on old stone walls, each flicker weaving a story of tranquil moments long past. Your eyes grow heavy with the sense of timelessness, as though the night itself has cradled 1,000 whispered songs, each one singing you toward rest. No need to strain for more details or debate the logic of hush hour any further. Those tales, of kings and choirs, of hidden areas and secret lullabies, have done their work. You can let them go now, drifting into a peaceful, half-awake dreamscape. The lines between then and now blur, all absorbed into the gentle darkness. Feel the weight of your eyelids, the softness in your muscles, the quiet hum of the space around you. Perhaps there's a fan whispering in the background, or the distant hush of traffic. Whatever it is, it's your lull, your cue to settle deeper into rest. Let your breaths lengthen. Let your thoughts fade to a gentle glow. Tonight, the ancient hushed hour laws have become your personal invitation to embrace serenity, to lay down the day's burdens, and to slip into that gentle cradle of sleep. You are safe, you are warm, and the hush is here to guide you. Listen to its steady pulse, and know that in this moment, everything is as it should be, calm, soft, and ready for you to drift away.